Good evening, everybody. I'm André Plourde. I'm Dean of the Faculty of Public Affairs here at Carleton. So welcome to Carleton and welcome to the River Building. This is the most recent addition to Carleton's campus. We opened the River Building officially on September the 5th. So this is a great place to have this kind of event. It's also quite appropriate to have a lecture jointly sponsored by the Public Policy Forum and Carleton University within this building. This is the home of 5 units of the Faculty of Public Affairs. So it's a good match. The event and the location work quite nicely. So welcome and thank you for being here tonight. My job is not just to say a few words about Carleton, but it's to introduce David Mitchell, who is the president of the Public Policy Forum, CEO as well, and he joined the forum in January of 2009. David, however, is no stranger to the world of post-secondary education. Previously, he served as vice president at 3 Canadian universities: Queen's, the University of Ottawa, and Simon Fraser University, directing fundraising and external relations at each institution. He achieved notable successes in strategic positioning and fund development. David Mitchell's diverse career path has also included senior positions in both the public and private sectors. He served as a member of the British Columbia Legislature from 1991 to 1996 and had previously gained experience in parliamentary procedure and legislative processes as deputy clerk of the Saskatchewan Legislature. Mr. Mitchell has also significant private sector business experience, having held executive positions within Western Canadian resource industries. An award-winning writer and former newspaper columnist, Mr. Mitchell contributes to several newspapers and magazines and serves as a frequent public affairs commentator on television and radio. Ladies and gentlemen, David Mitchell.
Thank you very much, André. Merci, mon ami. C'est bien gentil. Mesdames et messieurs, je vous souhaite le bienvenue au nom du Forum des politiques publiques. I welcome you all this evening, and I agree with André. What a nice partnership it feels like for my colleagues from the Public Policy Forum who are here to be here with the Faculty of Public Affairs at Carleton. That's something we're very proud to be in partnership with. And Carleton University and the Public Policy Forum, we're really proud of our partnership. So I thank the President and Vice Chancellor, Rosanne O'Reilly-Runty, for her spirit of partnership and her welcoming to this fantastic new building on the Carleton campus, the River Building. What a great venue. I've already been to a few events here. It's a great architectural addition, not only to this campus, but to Ottawa, so it's great to be back. I'd like to tell you that this is the 25th anniversary year for the Public Policy Forum. That's a big deal for a non-governmental organization. And we're having a lot of fun celebrating our silver anniversary. One of the things we've initiated is a lecture series. A lecture series that would allow the forum to bring to some leading university campuses in our country some thought leaders to discuss the future of public policy. We started this series at Dalhousie University earlier this year. André Picard from the Globe and Mail spoke about the future of Medicare. We have a couple of other events coming up in the next short while. Next month, we will be at the University of Victoria with Chantal Hébert, the journalist. And a little bit after that, we'll be at the University of Calgary with Huguette Lebel, who I'm very pleased to say is with us this evening. And many of you will know Huguette, who is the chair of Transparency International and until recently served with great distinction as the Chancellor of the University of Ottawa. Welcome, Huguette. You know, at the Public Policy Forum, we believe very simply that good government, robust public policy, and strong democratic institutions depend upon the contributions of all sectors. So this lecture series is one of our ways of reaching out to the next generation of policy leaders. And it's a chance for some dialogue. So tonight, after our lecturer speaks, there will be an opportunity, time permitting, for some comments and questions. And I'm just going to mention, for those of you who are so inclined, we have a Twitter hashtag right here, PPF Dodge, for those who are so inclined. We were going to say Dodge PPF, but we decided not to do that. PPF Dodge, hashtag. And I know that there are some of you this evening who will be tweeting some of the points that are made this evening. Let me just see. I'm just looking at our audience. Is Charles Perron here from our friend? No? Okay. I'd like to thank our sponsors. And we have a slide that I'm going to ask to be put up on the slide here to show you who our 25th anniversary sponsors are at the Public Policy Forum. We get by with a little help from our friends. Thank you, Mary Rose. So here they are. It's a rather large group of organizations who have really sustained the Public Policy Forum for this 25th anniversary year. And I want to thank all of our partners. A number of them are represented here this evening. And let me just add, as I introduce our guest speaker this evening, that tonight we are so proud, we're honored really, to introduce a lecture by a very distinguished Canadian. Many of you will know David Dodge. He's got a long association, I'm very proud to say, with the Public Policy Forum. David is often at the table when we convene serious policy discussions on issues related to public finance and other issues. He was honored by the Public Policy Forum at our annual testimonial dinner and awards in Toronto just a few years ago. And even as recently as 2 weeks ago, David was with us in Calgary for our annual Western dinner, where he spoke eloquently about the importance of matchmakers, bridge builders, individuals, leaders who can build bridges across sectors. You know, it was comments that were very near and dear to our hearts at the Public Policy Forum, because this is what we aspire to do, to build bridges across sectors. And when David spoke about that, I can tell you many people in the packed audience in Calgary a couple of weeks ago have quoted him back to me on this theme. The interesting thing is that David himself really represents an exemplar of a bridge builder. He has had, as many of you know, an impressive history in our country and especially here in Ottawa. As a public service leader, David Dodge has held senior positions in the Central Mortgage and Housing Corporation, the Anti-Inflation Board, the Department of Employment and Immigration. After serving in a number of senior positions at the Department of Finance, including that of G7 Deputy, he was appointed Deputy Minister of Finance, where he served from 1992 to 1997. In that role, he also served as a member of the Bank of Canada's Board of Directors. In 1998, David Dodge was appointed Deputy Minister of Health, a position he held until his appointment as Governor of the Bank of Canada, a position he served in with great distinction. He served as Governor of the Bank of Canada for a term of 7 years, from 2001 to 2008. Now, currently, David Dodge is Chancellor of Queen's University, a senior advisor at the law firm Bennett Jones. He's a member of the boards of directors of Canadian Utilities Limited, the C.D. Howe Institute, the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research, of which he serves as chair, the Bank of Nova Scotia, ATCO Limited. Also, he co-chairs the Global Market Monitoring Group of the International Institute of Finance, and he's a member of the International Advisory Council for the Central Bank of the United Arab Emirates. On top of all this, he's been elected as a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. So if you think retirement from the Public Service of Canada is for slouches, you got it wrong when you think of David Dodge, who's got to be as busy and as impactful as at any time in his very illustrious career. The title of his lecture this evening, and we're going to put it up on the screen here, the title of his lecture this evening is Strengthening the Canadian Economic Union in a Period of Fluctuating Resource Prices. Please join me, ladies and gentlemen, in welcoming David Dodge.
Well, thank you, David, and thank you all for coming this evening. Thank you, Andre. Great to have you here back in the East again. And thank you, Roseanne. And thank you for being in this fantastic building. Andre, you've really done something with this faculty here. Boy, oh boy. And it's a real pleasure for me to participate in this 25th anniversary series of the Public Policy Forum. Now, ladies and gentlemen, economic unions, like marriages, require great effort to construct and perhaps even greater efforts to maintain and strengthen. And just like marriages, they've got to be seen to be advantageous to all members. And that, I think, all of us now understand as we watch the trials and tribulations of the European Economic Union. And I thought that it would be worthwhile to spend a little bit of time trying to think about our own and the components that glue it together and how we cope with one of the components that always makes it very difficult, and that is fluctuating resource prices. Now, if you think about it, an economic union really consists of a number of components. It's a single market, it's a fiscal union, it's a transfer union, and it's a monetary union. And that is kind of a complete economic union. And part, of course, of the problem that Europeans are having is that they have an incomplete union. They really don't have a fiscal union, nor do they have a transfer union. Now, we have all of those. And in that economic union, the central government, our federal government, is really seen as doing two things. It's a manager of the union, but it also is a redistributor or a distributor across the union. And since Confederation, the government of Canada has played that role as both a manager and a redistributor. As a manager, basically managing economic development, and if you think of it right from the start, really the predecessor of the modern Federal Provincial Relations Office was the railway minister. Because that was the glue, in a sense, that was providing or holding the union together. First, the Intercolonial Railway initially, then, of course, the CPR. But it's also played a role as a distributor, and that's been true right since the beginning as well, when direct transfers to the new provincial governments were made to replace the revenues that they lost by giving up the power to raise customs duties to the central government. So both of these things have been present in our union right from the start. And they are now, of course, reflected in our Constitution as of 1982 in terms of Section 36.1, which requires governments and legislatures, note it's governments and legislatures, to promote equal opportunities and further economic development to reduce disparity, and provide public services of reasonable quality to all Canadians. Now you say, why doesn't economists start with law? Not just because I'm with a law firm now, but because it is kind of important in understanding the fundamental essence of this union we have. And second in Section 36 is Section 36.2, which says that provincial government should have sufficient revenues to provide reasonably comparable levels of public services at reasonably comparable levels of taxation. So that's kind of where we are. That's our basic law, if you will. And it talks about both the managerial role of the federal government and governments in general, and secondly, about the importance of what we now call the transfer union, the distributive part of government. And I would say, I'd be prepared to argue, that since kind of the mid-1960s through until perhaps the beginning of this last decade, what we had was increasing concentration of federal effort on 36.2, although by no means exclusively. So that's a bit of a change from our historical pattern, whereas if you go back to Confederation and the early years, certainly right through the first century, the emphasis would be on what we now know as 36.1. But my thesis is that the fundamental shifts that have taken place or are taking place over this first quarter century of the new, century, is going to make it increasingly difficult to realize what we aspired to in Section 36.2, and that emphasis is going to have to be put on investments by the federal government to build the own source fiscal capacity of lower income provinces through economic development so that they might provide services of reasonable quality as is set out in 36.1, i.e., essentially that the federal government goes back to its roots and that the economic development aspect it becomes more important. Now let's go through a tiny bit of economic analysis to start with. I mean, essentially you can think of two sectors in the economy. There's the natural sector based on natural resources, and there is the nurtured sector, which is manufacturing and services, which to a large extent depends on public policy and the actions of people, not the physical endowment of the land, but our human endowment and our policy framework. And the problem, of course, is that the relative prices of this manufacturers and services on one hand and resources on the other hand keep changing. They keep changing with the cycle, and they change over time with changes in technology and the evolution of global demand. And so there are big changes in the terms of trade between these two sectors, and that really wouldn't be such a big deal in economic union terms if, in fact, all members of the union, all components of the union, all provinces, were equally endowed with resources and efforts on the manufacturing and service side. But of course, provinces have very different resource intensity. And that is the nature of our federation. And that actual nature does change over time as the economic value of resources change. Whether you go back to Harold Innis and the fur trade, or you come right through today talking about oil and gas and potash and so on. And so changes in the terms of trade between these two sectors really represents big changes in interprovincial terms of trade, and hence big stresses on our federation, as at some points in time and given some technologies or some configurations of world demand, some provinces end doing very much better than other provinces. And we're a big country, and while labor and capital are mobile to a certain extent, they're not totally mobile, and hence we have big changes in the relative position of provinces within the federation. So what's going on? Well, these changes are a result of both cyclical factors, we're used to that, and big structural factors. At the moment, we're in the middle of a commodity supercycle, which began, let's say, dated sometime around the beginning of this century. Probably will go on to sometime around the quarter century mark, called a commodity supercycle. That's going on, and that has boosted the relative incomes of the commodity producing provinces. At the same time, our major trading partner, the United States, we've seen a big decline in the strength of the U.S. Midwest and Great Lakes states, of which Ontario is part. We're embedded in that region. So, in terms of trade, cars versus barrels of oil have turned against Ontario at the very same time as the strength of our natural trading region in Ontario, the Great Lakes states, has declined. It's not departed from the United States. It's just located on the southern border of the United States in northern Mexico rather than the northern border of the United States and Canada. Big change in structure then in our trade patterns within North America, a change of course in our global trade patterns, and at the same time, of course, because we've had changes in these terms of trade, which generally have favored Canada as a whole, we've had an appreciation of the Canadian dollar. So that's what's gone on in this decade so far, and indeed is likely to go on for at least the remainder of this decade and into the next. And so we have some provinces which are growing relatively rapidly. Alberta, BC, Saskatchewan, Newfoundland. Canada, you can see in red in the middle. And then those that are growing at about the national average. Manitoba's always at about the national average. No different this time around. And then those that are growing slowly. And you'll notice in those that are growing slowly, right here now near the bottom of the distribution is our most popular populous province of Ontario. And so the nature now of our federation as we stand here today and as we look forward over the next decade is that these relatively small provinces, which constitute roughly 30% of population and economic weight, are above the average, and almost 70% of the population in economic weight sits below the average. So that makes it rather difficult if you think about what happens is that we now have 30% of the country, which in some sense is looked to under Section 36(2) of the Constitution to be providing support to the 70%. This is a big difference. We've never been in that position before, that has been the case. And by and large, we coasted along for the first 120 years of Confederation, more or less, with a large part of the country making transfers to a small part of the country. Quite doable then. Now we're in a rather different position. And given what's happened, that's where we are today, and given what's happened as we look forward over the next decade or so, this problem that we witness today is going to get more severe. And I could go through all sorts of numbers, but I think this is after dinner, so I won't do that. I'd rather turn to a picture then of what this means for provincial revenues. This is on a per capita basis. And here up on the top line here you have the province of Alberta, where revenues per capita of the province of Alberta go from about 12,000 up to about 18,000. And right at the bottom, of course, you have our friend PEI, where revenues are growing from about 4,300 to just over 5,000 over the period. But what is really striking, and this dashed line here is the average, what is really striking is that Ontario is below the average. Remember, 37% weight, roughly speaking, below the average, and is getting farther below the average as we go out. And that then gives you what provinces could raise, if you will, their tax base that they have, their revenue base that the provinces have. And so how does this differ from history? Well, it differs from history in a big way, that what you've had is a replacement of this big 37% of the population with Newfoundland. This is Newfoundland here, with roughly 700,000, 750,000 people, or about 3% of the population. So that's been the shift. We've got 4 provinces above the line, just as we've always had, but in weight of population, in weight of GDP, that is just not the case. So that's the distributive problem that we have in Canada as we look out over the next century, decade, I'm sorry. And that's quite different than what we've had over the last century, where the big populous provinces have been able to support the others. Now, some have been in and out, like Saskatchewan, have been sometimes a receiver, sometimes a giver, but always we've had the bulk of the population in above-the-line provinces. So that then leaves us in a more difficult position if we think of the role of the federal government in trying to ensure some degree in this marriage of 10 provinces, some degree of unity across the country, that people are not left behind. Federal transfers have, in fact, go to the top here, with fixed provincial exchange rate. That's where I want to be. You can't deal with this problem by changing the interprovincial exchange rates. And so the main way of equalizing across provinces has been the federal government equalization program, although other programs such as the health transfer and the social transfer have had some equalizing impact because they're equal per capita. You're going to have widening disparities over time as we go forward. And provinces are going to be left then to deal with this issue. And so in many ways, the problem comes is to how indeed we can look at ways to actually generate higher revenues, own revenues in individuals' provinces. So what our projections then indicate is that greatly increased transfers will be required to bring receiving provinces up to the average. But we have a federal government which, for good and sufficient reasons, has said that the equalization program, the amount of money they're going to devote to these equalization payments, is going to be capped at the nominal GDP growth rate. And that means, because the disparities are widening, that the ability to raise provincial revenues per capita up to the level they would have been had there been no cap grows over time. At the moment, it's roughly 12% of pre-cap entitlements. It'll grow to about 22% by 2020, and will continue to grow after that. And that is kind of our base case projection. If we had a real oil price shock, the problem would be more severe than in the base case. So that's kind of the dilemma, if you will, the federal government finds itself in, given that we are in this rather long period of relatively high resource prices. Now, it's really important to note that we had, take it from Ontario's standpoint for a moment, we had a period from roughly 1983, when oil prices fell out of bed, through until the early 2000s, 2003 or so, where indeed oil prices were low, resource prices were relatively low, and indeed manufacturing did extraordinarily well. So there was a period in there from sort of the mid-'80s until early in this decade, when in fact the terms of trade had favored the manufacturing provinces, and Ontario appeared to be doing reasonably well, indeed was above the line, and the traditional transfer mechanism could continue. But as we've going through this decade and the next, that has broken down. And what it means is that Ontario, which used to be a contributor, today gets roughly 20% of equalization payments, would, even under the current system, go to 30% by 2020. And with the system being capped, what it means is they're taking away from somebody else. So that creates a very real problem to which there are no easy answers. And we've tried to look at, and indeed there are federal provincial groups now trying to look at solutions to this. Are there tinkering with the formula solutions that will help? Well, obviously, you could change a little bit the calculation of whether you include resource revenues or don't include resource revenues in equalization. That one, of course, as Andre will know, coming from Alberta, has been a big bugbear of the Albertans. They say it shouldn't be included. The irony, of course, is that the receiving province with the largest share of resource revenues is Quebec. And so Albertans who wish that they didn't have to make these transfers to Quebec would be very surprised to find that if they took resource revenues out, indeed, Quebec would get even more. And would certainly gain at the expense of Ontario. You could change the calculation of the cap, the way the cap is calculated technically. That would give Ontario a bigger share. But fundamentally, you can't solve the broad disparity by tinkering with the mechanics of the cap and the mechanics of the formula. And the Prime Minister's actually been very smart politically in saying, well, we'll strike a committee of provincial officials to sort this out. Of course, they won't be able to sort it out, and because it's not sort-outable unless you remove the cap itself. So what about removing the cap? That has been the big issue, and of course all premiers initially said, remove the cap. Well, that would certainly mean the federal government would have to raise more taxes in order to provide the revenue to pay the provinces. But the irony of that, of course, is that the federal tax base and the Ontario tax base are almost the same, i.e. there's essentially no resource royalty revenue in the Ontario tax base. There's none in the federal base. And so all that would happen is that the federal government would be raising the standard taxes, all of which was be paid disproportionately by the people of Ontario to pay themselves. And so from an Ontario standpoint, raising the cap is not a good idea. It'd be much better for Ontario to raise taxes itself. then at least they get 100% of the revenues that would be raised by increasing income taxes or sales tax. So you then end with an enormous problem. You can't solve the interprovincial allocation problem without raising the cap. If you raise the cap, you do nothing for the province of Ontario, which is the biggest problem in the system. And so you end with a political problem that is really goes beyond arithmetic. You can't solve it arithmetically because structurally, we have a divergence of incomes where the largest province, in fact, is the creator of the problem. So in the end, as the conclusion here at the bottom is, if we continue, and if the federal government were to continue to focus on 36.2, i.e. redistribution, it really is a zero-sum game, and it would breed increased regional resentment. So what then is the solution? Seems to me the solution is, in fact, to go back and place once again, focus more on 36.1, i.e. federal investments that build capacity in the manufacturing and service sectors in all provinces. Now, this is, I think, really quite important and is not as divisive as it might seem at first blush. Because in the strongest growth provinces, Alberta and Saskatchewan, those are the very provinces where the export-oriented manufacturing and service industries have the greatest problem. They cannot get labor, they cannot get capital, it's being absorbed by the hydrocarbon industry in one way or another. In fact, the least competitive manufacturing and service sectors are indeed in Alberta and Saskatchewan. And that's a big problem for them, as Andre will know very well from the debates out there. It's an enormous problem for them because what they are seeing is an economy which had 4 strings in the violin to keep it strong. 3 of those strings are kind of withering, and they're left with only 1. And so when resource prices turn down, as they may well do at some point, and did with a crash in 1983, then they're going to be left with very little economic base. And so there is really quite a strong argument, even in those strong high-income provinces, to think about what it is a federal government can do to support the growth of manufacturing and service industries, or at least to lean against the wind of their decline that is blowing. And of course, in so doing, policy that strengthens those areas is one that would be of great benefit to lower income provinces, and in particular, central Canada, and indeed would promote positive convergence. But we have moved a long way in the last 40 years away from thinking of the federal role as a real economic development role. That's not true at the most macro end. We had tax reform, we had free trade, all of which were clearly, in broad sense, contributors. But we've moved away about thinking about policies that would help to strengthen and help to build specifically competitive manufacturing and service industries. And so I think there is really a win-win solution that would achieve both greater national and provincial growth and stability, certainly stability over time, over the resource cycle through a broadened economic base, and that would have an advantage clearly for provinces like Ontario and Quebec, but would have a major advantage for provinces that are suffering the greatest hollowing out of their manufacturing and service economies, and that is, at the moment, Saskatchewan and Alberta, a lot of it having been hollowed out already in BC, and the only one where it was almost non-existent to start with was Newfoundland, which is actually doing reasonably well. But so that's kind of the game then that it seems to me that we have to think about. Now, there are no easy answers at all as to how to develop this win-win solution. But I thought in this crowd, we could at least put up some examples that we might want to think about, examples of federal investment that would build towards a win-win solution. Now, I think there are some things that are sitting right in front of us that are quite evident. Others will require a lot more thought. So one of the big issues, if you sit here in this province, as everybody knows, is electricity. Probably, if you think about the province of Ontario going back to the end of the war, we had two great advantages. We had a lot of rocks up in Sudbury, and we had a lot of hydropower. And so this province, which was the natural locus of manufacturing, also had a couple of resources that were really good. Well, the rocks are still there, although maybe a little more expensive to extract than they used to be. Although now gold is $1,700 rather than $35, so some offsets to the problem. But we have an enormous electricity problem. And if we are to have manufacturing industry, even the high-end manufacturing of high-tech gizmos, computers and having cloud storage and all that sort of stuff, you need electricity. And even more so, of course, if you want to continue to have an automobile industry, an aircraft industry, or whatever. So we got a big problem. So one of the things the federal government could do, since we face the end of our nuclear plants, unless we refurbish them, and they provide 75% of the base load, would be to help with that refurbishment, rather than walking away from AECL and the nuclear industry, to think about supporting it. You might walk away from AECL, but you don't want to walk away from support of the nuclear industry. Very important for this province, and has a side benefit, maybe, if we could develop small enough generating plants that we could use them up in the oil sands as well. The second one we can think about is an Eastern oil pipeline. Now, this goes way back to the great pipeline debate of '56, which was a great national project. But if you think about it, maybe, just maybe, we can devise an effective way to get that bitumen out by coming east and build some capacity in the east to do that, deal with the spread between Brent and WTI prices on that. So there's another area where a federal government, in fact, actually could play an important role, rather than backing away and saying, no, we're going to keep our hands off this issue, although we'll keep our hands on the issue of getting a pipeline to Kidmat. You can also think then of the next generation of our traditional manufacturing industries, whether it's automobiles or transportation equipment or aerospace. We got pressed in 2008 to provide money to support the old industry. We've not really thought very much about what we could do to support the industry that is to come. And that actually is something that I think could make sense. I won't say it does, but is something that could make sense and should certainly be thought about. Military procurement. We've not been very good in this country in dealing with that, and we know we've got to buy new ships and trucks. That can be located, of course, reasonably located in the have-not provinces. Much more difficult, and something that does require some real thought, are to build our service industries as export industries. So our financial industry is actually a very good export industry. It'd be a lot better one if indeed we could have a single regulator, and there's no reason that we shouldn't have the TMX being the acquirer of London rather than sitting on the other side of that as we were. And a lot of that has to do with federal regulation. Telecom, again, a good example where federal regulation could help us turn ourselves into a telecom exporter. Education services, another one, although I think we certainly started in 98 to do something along this, but again, to think of that as an export sector. And finally, of course, medical services. And I think this is an important one. We think of medical services only as us, but of course, it's a tremendous export industry if we organize ourselves properly and deal with it. Urban transit and tourism, and you put those together because indeed we think of urban transport just to getting people to work in towns and say, well, it's up to the towns. But indeed, the cities, having global cities that work is a great source, actually, of tourism revenue as well. And here, I think there is a role for the federal government, maybe not exactly the same role that they used to try to play under the old Ministry of State for Urban Affairs, but nevertheless something we should be thinking about. And finally, gateways are extraordinarily important, although dealing with that guy in Michigan that owns the bridge is not proven to be so easy. But all I'm saying is these are all hard things to do. They require thought, they require energy, they require analysis, they require thinking about the data that you need to do it. There is a real role here for the federal government, not quite as simple as the old railways and canals days, but nevertheless there's a really important role here for the federal government. And I think we have to sit back now and ask ourselves, if we truly want to continue with this union called Canada, then we have to think very hard about what it is the federal government is going to do to increase the incomes, the earned incomes of people right across the country, so that the provinces have a tax base that they can do and provide the services which they choose to provide. If they choose to provide very high-end services, they can do so. If they choose lower-end services, they can do so. But the provinces need a tax base to do that. Otherwise, we're stuck with this federal transfer mechanism. So, let me conclude then. I think we really need to go back and look at the broader economic objectives, i.e., think about the more traditional economic development rules. Think very hard about what Section 31 says. That is to adopt a build and grow strategy federally and provincially. Now, I've talked so far the last few minutes about the federal government, but clearly there are important roles for provinces, and indeed for resource-producing provinces. What is absolutely critical, if all this is to work, is that they sequester those resource revenues and use them for development purposes rather than use them for providing current services. And that's an absolutely critical issue, very tough one for the Premier of Alberta, very tough one for the Premier of Saskatchewan, very tough in Newfoundland, but nevertheless that's kind of a critical, important part of the deal that, that provinces that want to provide much better services, as does the province of Alberta relative to Ontario, for example, that they have to be willing to go to their own taxpayers. They have to go to their own taxpayers and say, are you really willing to provide the money for that? Nothing wrong with providing good services, but you got to pay for them, and people got to understand they got to be paid for. And finally, and I think this is really important, the wording of section 36.2 says comparable levels of service at comparable levels of taxation. Whereas the wording of 36.1, interestingly enough, talks about providing services of reasonable quality. And I think that is very important that we think about that. Because to the extent that we are really saying that every province has to provide the same level of services to their residents, or comparable levels of services to their residents, then indeed we are really in a box, given that no amount of equalization is going to bridge the differences in that graph that I showed you in terms of capacity. Even if we can narrow that, the differences are very large. And so I think we do have to think very hard in our rhetoric and in our approach about thinking of what is kind of the reasonable minimal level of service that we want to ensure. And then above that, wealthier provinces or provinces that are willing to tax more heavily would provide a higher level of service. And in all of that, hopefully, as we move forward, we will prevent the fraying of our union because some parts of the union feel that they are being left so far behind the rest of the union that they become very unhappy and unwilling partners, or other parts of the union think that they are having to pay so much for all the deadbeats elsewhere that they no longer want to be part of the union. And that is our challenge. I think we can meet it, but I think we're going to need to meet it through emphasis on economic development rather than emphasis on transfers. So that's my contention, and now we discuss.
Don't go away. Lecture. That was really terrific, a tour de force. It raises a number of questions, and I'm going to go to the microphones that are positioned in two different parts of the room. Before I go to the first question, I just want to ask you one just to lead off. Strengthening the economic union. That's what you've been talking about. But you're talking about a union that is different than the one that perhaps Canadians have come to know in the past. You're talking about an interesting renewed version of what the economic union might look like. It implies some change, it implies some innovation, and it certainly suggests there's a strong role for the federal government, which may run against the grain of our times today. Without the federal government asserting itself in those areas like the ones you've identified, is it conceivable that the economic union could evolve with leadership at the subnational level from the provinces and the territories through the Council of the Federation and other provincial subnational bodies? Because it seems to hinge on the federal government playing a more assertive role than has been the case in recent times.
I think the answer is it could. The rather recent meeting in Government House in Edmonton would, I think, be a better indicator of what's likely to happen if you leave it up to the individual provinces to deal with it. It's very hard for an individual premier who is elected by his or her electorate to operate in that way. Statesmanship is exhibited at the very end of the mandate or once you're no longer premier. Very hard to exhibit it at the start of your mandate.
Yeah, we have a lot of formers who are great statespersons in our country. We're going to go to the microphones, and I'm going to ask you to identify yourself first and then make your comment, observation, or direct a question to our lecturer. I'll start over here at this microphone.
Chris Waddell from the School of Journalism and Communication. Two-part question for David. Does the federal public service in 2012 have the intellectual and analytical capability to do what you described? And second of all, well, it was a serious question. And second of all, how do you do it without engendering a range of trade responses from the United States in terms of trade actions? Because their industries, our industries that are in trouble, or to a significant degree, their industries that are in trouble too.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the capacity is there. The question is the will to use the capacity. And if there's a will to use it, then the capacity is there and will come forward. The trade issue is a very interesting one. And I guess all I'm saying is we in Canada have been Boy Scouts to sort of the highest standards of Lord Baden-Powell. And there are no other scout brigade in the world that operates to quite those standards. And yes, there are risks in that regard. But of course, our trading partners don't operate to those standards either. And so where's the risk? Is the risk that the Europeans, who are very much champion-oriented, would come down on us? Are there a risk that the Americans, who use their military for precisely this thing, they dress it up in military guise as opposed to anything else, will come down on it? I think we could do a lot more. Obviously, there are some risks, but I think we could do a lot more.
Thank you for those questions, Chris. This microphone over here, please identify yourself.
Thank you. My name's Hendrik from the University of Ottawa. Some in the Obama administration have talked about having a lower corporate tax rate for manufacturers because it's so tough to compete in a very difficult global environment. What do you think about that? Do you think it makes sense for Canada to have one corporate tax rate for all corporations irrespective of which sector they're in, or could you make choices like that?
Well, I mean, historically, of course, we provided more of the breaks in the resource sector than we have in the manufacturing sector, and we provided no breaks at all in the service sector. I mean, on a tax basis, you would like something that is neutral and low. That's what really makes sense. So that is, I think, in the end, where we should be. There's always a question on CCA, capital cost allowance rates. What are the appropriate capital cost allowance rates? That is a tricky issue. But by and large, what you would rather have is a relatively low, pretty flat, pretty neutral corporate tax rate. And by and large, that will do the right job for you.
Okay, thank you. Please.
Gaëtan Lucier. David, I have appreciated enormously your analytical explanation of the situation. I have a question to you to help me to understand when you're referring in heavy investment in manufacturing, it will need to go to export because Canada is not growing that fast to satisfy the needs. So that means we will need to be very, very competitive and efficient, which we're not necessarily presently, or it would need to be in area where there would be some very narrow ability to be competing. And then there we'll have a problem of having the necessary labor force to make it happen. So help me to understand. And I have a comment after that. I feel a bit sad, David, that you have not been referring to agriculture and food as being an element of growth where Canada is probably one of the leaders that could be satisfying the growing needs of 7 billion to 9 billion people in that period of time?
So, I mean, the issue of unit costs, which was your first question, is a very real issue for us. It's a very real issue in all industries. In fact, because with high resource prices, we're low grading in the resource industries. Our unit costs there are in fact highest. I mean, in many ways, we're most marginal actually in some of these resource industries. And a big decline in prices means we lose our market because we are essentially high-cost producers. A big decline in prices would probably would work to our favor on the manufacturing and service side. But yes, I mean, we face a real challenge to get our unit costs down or to get our productivity up in manufacturing. We face a real challenge to provide services that are exportable. And exportable, let's be very clear. They're exposed to foreign competition. Either we export or we import, but you're trying to deal with foreign competition. And you know, it's very easy to say, boy, we can't do that. On the other hand, if you think about the technological advances that we're going through right at the moment, they actually are allowing runs economically to get shorter and shorter and shorter. And so there is no reason that, in fact, we are necessarily constrained in the same way we were in the 1950s, when getting runs longer and longer and longer was the key to success. Let me then turn to the food industry. I mean, there are two components here. One is growing the stuff. The other is processing the stuff. Processing really goes to the issue, Gaetan, that I was talking about. If we can get our unit costs down, get our productivity up, there's absolutely no reason we can't do the job. In terms of growing the stuff, I think there are tremendous opportunities there, and it is likely that North America as a whole, not just Canada, but North America as a whole, will actually increase agriculture's share of GDP as we go forward, because we are relatively more efficient in producing it. What we got to do is capture some of the processing here in this country as we go forward.
Yeah, very good. Thank you. Thank you for those questions. Please.
Chuck Freeman, Carleton University. David, one comment and two quick questions. The comment is that one of the issues that sits behind all this, and it's probably one we can do nothing about, is the fact that royalties, by and large, belong to the provinces. If we had a different constitutional set of arrangements, of course, many of the problems you raise would disappear, at least interprovincially. So, you know, I don't know if they can do anything about that, and I suspect we can't, but nonetheless, that is what lies behind some of this. Two questions. One is, you talked a lot about interprovincial terms of trade, but of course, there's the intersectoral terms of trade. And what I hear is, unless you think that raw material prices are going to come down in a fairly near future, and I'm not sure that is going to be the case, that we should be trying to shift resources from the high-priced resource industry to the low-priced manufacturing industry. And of course, the whole point of relative prices changing is precisely to allow resources to go there. And indeed, as you pointed out, Alberta is already overstressed in terms of their ability to deal with even the resources that are available to them to work in the resource industry. So it's going to, you know, it sounds to me as if the sort of overall GDP is going to come down, at least the GDP per capita, by this kind of movement away from resources, which is what I think it sounds like. The second one is what sounds to me like a industrial policy. You may want to use a different word. What makes you think that the federal government coming in the future years will do better on that than they seem to have done in past times?
Okay. I mean, you're absolutely right that at a point of time when you divert real resources from the resource sector to the non-resource sector. At that point of time, at that particular set of relative prices, indeed, you do have a loss. What you're doing is you're trying to avoid a problem of falling out of bed at some point in the future. So in a sense, you're trying to take a longer time horizon approach than you would if you took it just at a point in time, which is precisely why I made the point that we actually had a set of relative prices from, let's say, the mid-'80s until the beginning of this century that were underpricing resources, overpricing manufacturers, and we coasted along as if we didn't have to really do anything then about manufacturing and service because it was taking care of itself. Americans were coming to shop in Canada. I mean, things looked all rosy in the garden. But in fact, what you had was a set of relative prices which in the longer term were out of whack on the other side. And so the whole point, I think, is that, and it's of interest not just interprovincially but within provinces, that we try to, if you will, lean against the wind a little bit of the current relative prices and try to think that through a little bit. I mean, you remember, Chuck, that the words that were said, oh, we have a bunch of lazy manufacturers in this country, because in fact, at that point, manufacturing labor was priced in international terms too low, just as at the moment we say, well, it's priced too high. I'm not sure it's priced too high. It's just that the world has changed. So I think while it's risky, I think you do have to try to think about that longer trajectory, as we try to do in a number of other areas. Now, is that industrial policy? Partly, I guess, it's industrial policy, although it's not trying to pick winners, firm winners, as we have discussed in the past. All we're trying to do, in some sense, is to a playground that got tipped by current relative prices in one direction. We're trying to tip it back a little bit to where we think the mean might be over a longer period of time. Are there dangers in that? Of course there are dangers in that. But there's real dangers in following the immediate relative prices and allowing, A, the union to get pulled apart by that, but B, also there's a real danger as you look ahead that you actually will fall off the cliff. And you remember the famous bumper sticker from 1984 in Alberta. Lord, give me a boom and I promise I won't blow it next time. Right? So it happens on both sides. And all I'm saying is that I think there is a role for government, an active role for government to cut through that.
Okay, thank you. David, I think we have time for two more brief interventions. We'll go here first and then over here last. Please.
Ted Legg. I'm one of the retired members of the intellectual pool that Chris Waddell was talking about. Huguette was my deputy. And when Huguette and David left the public service, the intellectual level went down. And when I retired, it went back up again. 1983, I suggest, is a different time than today. We now have the emerging nations of China and India and other ones. If you look at the 30-year trend of manufacturing, it has been declining in the West as it's been moving from west to east. So my question is, if we start to try and raise the manufacturing capacity of the country, as you've suggested, and I'm not saying you're wrong, how is that going to work? if, in fact, manufacturing keeps on sluicing to the east, number one. And number two, I understand the equalization problem that you outlined, and I don't think it is mathematically fixable as the way it is presently formulated. Why don't we free up our labor mobility? Why don't we say, everybody in Ontario, go to Alberta, we'll build you a free house, give you free transportation, and sluice the whole 12 million of us over to there. Now they're all over there, all earning high salaries, and they can pay the equalization.
You know, capital is reasonably mobile, although not entirely. Actually, in Canada, the only country in the world that has perhaps greater labor mobility than we do are the Americans. And even there, I'm not actually sure. It's just that they cut themselves up into 48 units rather than 10. And so when you measure mobility, you get interstate mobility looks a lot higher than interprovincial mobility looks here. So is that a solution? Well, there are very real costs to extraordinarily rapid, trying to have very, very rapid growth. Indeed, the sensible solution is as the Albertans are doing, to source a number of the inputs into the oil and gas industry outside of Alberta, just as they're sourcing and have always sourced inputs to the agriculture industry from outside of Alberta. It's quite, actually, most goods are quite cheap to move. Ideas are even cheaper to move. So I'm not sure that mobility is as big a problem as it's made out to be. And it's obviously a problem, but not as big as it's made out to be. So, and I don't think it would solve the issues that are there.
Thank you. You get the bell. I'm going to give you the final opportunity here.
Thank you. David, thank you for a great presentation, and I was very pleased to hear your comments about not trying to fool around with equalization at this stage because of the dangers of it. But I was going to ask you, why did you not add to your list of federal possibilities in processing? But you just did a few minutes ago. And you know, when we're looking at our natural resources, and I would include agriculture in that, but many others as well. I think that there is some interesting possibility here which would translate into manufacturing. And looking at Asia, which I agree completely, you had great foresight at that time. But what is happening now, if you look at South Korea, their cost of production has increased because their staff are being paid much more. And this is beginning to inch its way into China as well, as more people have higher education. And therefore, you know, there is something happening there which could be helpful in a way to us, although, you know, you want China to live well as other countries. And the other factor are the destabilization of certain parts of the world. Whether you look at the Gulf countries now, Central Asia, and so on, which means that, which again you don't want to see, but it's there. And therefore, the list that you have there I think was very interesting, but what kind of incentive could the government introduce to assist in some of the points that you have made, but in particular with manufacturing and processing of natural resources?
That's the question of the tools. And I guess what I'm trying to do is not to be highly prescriptive here in terms of the tools, but rather to say, look, we better think about building that tool chest again, rather than saying we shouldn't have that tool chest, we should forget it, we should do away with it. Because what I think we have learned is that no matter whether we're talking about this element of economic structure, whether we're talking about financial sector and how we deal with that, that in fact you want to have a lot of tools, because you do the job best if you have a tool that is suited to the job, rather than trying to build a house with only a hammer and saw. It's really a lot better to have a number of tools that can be used. And there's a danger that they will get misused. That was Chuck's point. But I think we have to go back and think about that tool chest again, because in a sense we've only thought about the distributive side rather than thinking hard about building that tool chest. And we certainly had to think about the distributive side. We certainly had to think about getting our fiscal house in order in the 1990s. We certainly had to do that, but I think we have to go back and think about the tool chest that will allow us to deal with these problems.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your comments, your thoughtful observations, and please join me in thanking David Dodge. Thank you. And thank you all. Thank you all for being here this evening. I'd now like to invite the President and Vice Chancellor of Carleton University, Roseanne O'Reilly-Runta, to make some concluding remarks. Roseanne?
Thank you. Thank you. I feel like un cheveu sur la soupe, the last thing you need. It has been a true privilege to be here tonight to listen to you, Mr. Dodge. It's been a true privilege to sit here with so many people. One of the resources that you didn't mention was the people. And these are the resources for the future of Canada, and many of them are in this room. So thank you for caring about Canada. Thank you for caring about the future. Thank you for a really clear explanation which combines common sense and a little bit of economics, or a lot of common sense and a lot of economics, as well as a political understanding of the capacities of our country. At the beginning of the evening, we said thank you for the building. Ron Jackson, the chairman of our board, is here. He was vice chair of the board and member of our finance committee. We would not have this building if it weren't for Ron Jackson, so thank you, Ron. Much appreciated. Also thank the government for their investment, an example of that good investment in education. I have to thank our dean. When we asked him what his strategic plan for the year was, he said, I'm going to occupy the building. And we all chuckled. And tonight, when I looked at the crowd, I thought, well, he is occupying the building. You're all here. And then I thought to myself, no, he has actually done what a dean's job is, and that's to occupy it with your minds and with greater thoughts and with the challenges that we have of the future. So thank you, Mr. Dean. David Mitchell, thank you. Without the partnership of the Public Policy Forum, we would have never been able to get such a fine speaker here. And we thank you very much. And we thank you for doing it across the country and for equalizing the payment. You get label to another province, and we're grateful to you for doing that. But anytime the Public Policy Forum wants to come back and have a speech at Carleton, we promise to come and listen. David, you told us that you were against removing caps, but tonight I take mine off and doff it to you. Thank you.